Hello everybody and welcome to part 2 of this video on introducing film cameras. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about shutter speed, and I'm just going to describe it. I've got other resources that I think are going to be more helpful. Looking at example photos and so on, I'm going to show you where to find the shutter speed on a few cameras, but we're just kind of barely going over the basics here. You're going to probably want to do a little bit more research on your own and familiarize yourself with shutter speed. Shutter speed is one of the fundamental ways that we control our exposure on the camera, and it's also one of the ways that we control how motion appears in our pictures. Exposure is the amount of light that comes into the camera and hits the film. On this K1000, this is a mechanical manual camera. We set our shutter speed right here. There's a shutter speed dial. And you'll notice that most of the numbers are roughly half or double from each other. And if we go and look right here, this is 1000. You can see 1000 is selected, and you can see that the little triangle is pointing, that little red triangle is pointing at 1000. And then you can rotate it. I'm going to try to do this while I'm looking at my preview screen here. There we go. We're going to go to 500. Now, what do those numbers mean? You go all the way down to 1, and then there's a letter B after 1. So it goes 1,000, 500. You keep having that number, 250, 125. Half of 125 gets into a decimal, so we round to 60. And then 30 and 15, you get into a decimal if you have 15, so we'll go to 8. Then 4, 2, and 1. Then B. So what do these numbers mean? 1000 is actually setting a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second, which is a very short duration of time. And if I take this lens off and I set my shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second and I take a picture, you will see here inside the camera two things happening. Well, you're going to see one of those things happening. So here is a mirror. That's what's inside this camera. When I press this button, you will see that mirror flip up for 1/1000th of a second. And what you won't see is actually a shutter opening behind the mirror. 1/1000th of a second is an extremely short amount of time. And so what we're going to do is turn this dial down so that we can see what's happening. Let's turn it down to 1/8 of a second. Still a very short duration of time. In the grand scheme of things, 1/8 of a second on my whole day, especially like a really boring class, that's nothing, right? 1/8 of a second is nothing. In terms of photography, 1/8 of a second is a fairly slow shutter speed. So let's see if we can notice what happens here when I press the button at 1/8 of a second. Okay, so you could hear it more than see it, I think. But let's go ahead and turn it all the way down to 1 second. And here we go. Let's see what 1 second looks like. So there you saw the mirror popped up, and on the back of the camera, we see how there's an opening actually that opens up for that duration of time, for that 1 second. Now 1 second is an extremely slow shutter speed. And without the lens on there, there's no image, but we can see what's happening here now. Typically there's a lens on the front of the camera, and what's happening is light is coming into the lens and hitting the film for that duration of time, somewhere between 1 second and 1/1000th of a second. On a more modern camera, you might have half stops, or what we call sometimes a stop of light is 1 shutter speed when you double or half it. Sometimes you're able to actually get in between those whole shutter speeds. If you have a more modern camera like this N60 Nikon, right now the battery has died, so you can't see it, but what you'll see is actually an LCD readout here. You'll also see it in the viewfinder. You actually see your shutter speed there, and you'll see sometimes between 500th of a second and 1,000th of a second, you'll see sometimes 1/750th of a second, which would be a half stop. Halfway between 500 and 1,000 is 750. Sometimes you'll see thirds of a stop. So you'll see 1/600th of a second and 1/800th of a second and 1/1000th. Between 1,000th and 1/500th. The ths at the end get a little hard to say. Between 1/500th and 1/1000th of a second, you'll see sometimes 1 or 2 other shutter speeds in between those whole stops. We call those whole stops because what happens is we double or half the amount of time. Get this, we double or half the amount of light that's coming into the camera every time we double or half the amount of time. So the difference between 1/500th of a second and 1/1000th of a second in terms of the amount of light coming into the camera is the same as going from 1/500th of a second to 1/250th of a second. Whenever you double or half the amount of light, we call that a stop of light. And this becomes relevant when we start to look at aperture. Now, aperture is a setting on the lens, and I'm going to take the lens off here of this K1000. It's a little easier to see this. If I hold up that lens there, you can see a little opening. This opening here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, hexagon. It actually doesn't matter what it is. And is it easier to see from the back? It might be. It doesn't matter what the shape is. Sometimes they're perfect circles, hexagons, sometimes they're octagons, whatever it is. What's happening is that there is a setting on the lens that controls exposure, that controls the amount of light that comes into the camera by changing the size of this little iris in the lens. That is called aperture, or f-stop. Now, f-stop technically is the description of the aperture size. But f-stop and aperture generally we use interchangeably, so don't worry too much about that. And it's a little bit hard to see because there are a lot of numbers on this lens, but if I hold this up here, you should be able to see 22, 16, 11, 8, 5.64, 2.8, and 2. And if you look at the little red diamond, you'll see that that little red diamond is lining up with 16. And what that indicates to us is that the aperture is set to f16. And if I rotate this dial and I change the dial, watch what happens to that iris in the lens as I rotate the dial to a smaller number. That iris in the lens gets much bigger. This is set to f2, which is the largest opening. Let's look at a middle one. This is like f5.6, so this is a little bit smaller than f2 and a little bit bigger than f16, which is what we had originally set it to. So there you go. So as I rotate that dial, that aperture gets bigger and smaller. And what's changing is the amount of light coming into the camera. The amount of light coming into the camera or exposure is controlled by f-stops and shutter speeds. Now, how do you know which f-stop to put it at, and how do you know which shutter speed to put it at? Well, your light meter is going to tell you. The light meter. The light meter will give you a reading, a correct balance of which settings, which shutter speeds, which apertures to use for any given situation. Depending on the amount of light in your scene, if you're taking a picture outside on a sunny day, you'll probably need a faster shutter speed and or a smaller aperture. Less light gets in through a smaller opening. Makes sense, I think. Less light comes into the camera with a fast shutter speed, a shorter duration of time, less light comes into the camera. If you're shooting inside on a cloudy day or maybe in the evening just after the sun's gone down, well, you're probably going to need a larger aperture and or a slower shutter speed. And one thing you really have to watch out for is what we call camera shake. So if you're shooting with a slower shutter speed, and a rule of thumb is actually right around 1/60th of a second, but sometimes it might be easier to just think of 1/100th of a second. Anything slower than 1/60th, 1/100th, they're pretty close to each other. Anything slower than 1/60th of a second, there's a good chance you're going to have some camera shake, unless you're using a tripod. Camera shake generally just makes all of your photos kind of crappy and blurry. And so I want you to be really mindful that if you're going to take a picture with a slow shutter speed, you can do a couple of things to mitigate that shutter speed. You could just take your elbow, throw it right here on the table, take your other elbow, and take a deep breath, then take your picture, okay? That's one kind of option there. You could use a tripod, and even a cheap tripod is better than nothing. I learned from a National Geographic photographer was giving a talk one time and was telling us about this amazing sunset photo that he took that was on a billboard, and he said he used a mojito pod. And what happened was he was enjoying drinks in Miami, looking over the water. He had his camera but no tripod, so he took his mojito glass, put it down on the table, put his camera on top, held it with both hands, took a deep breath, and then took a picture. So you can stabilize the camera with a lot of different things. A tripod is a specific piece of equipment that's used for stabilizing cameras. So if you have access to a tripod, even a cheap one's going to be better than nothing, although you can spend thousands of dollars on tripods. And I would recommend spending, if you're going to make an investment in equipment, at least a couple $100. And what you get is a really versatile, really useful, really stable tripod. Something around 25, 30, 35, 40, 50, 60 bucks even, oftentimes are kind of rickety. It doesn't mean you can't use them effectively. What it likely means is that you're probably going to have to adapt your photography to suit this less than perfect device. That's fine. So let's back up and review. ISO, that's in a separate video, but that is the setting on the film itself, the sensitivity rating. How sensitive is the film to light? You set your ISO on the camera, and all you're doing there, by the way, is telling the camera what your ISO that you're using is, and then it calibrates the light meter, which we're going to talk about in a few, next video I should say. We'll talk about the light meter. It calibrates the light meter to the ISO that you're using. Shutter speed and aperture, you're going to choose those mostly based on what the light meter tells you, but a combination of those two things determines the correct exposure, how much light is coming into the camera. Let's talk a little bit about the light meter, and one of the things that you're going to find with older equipment like this K1000 is that oftentimes the light meter is the first thing to go. So as I put the lens on here, I'm going to look through here and I'm going to see if the light meter moves. And for this particular camera, you'll see a needle, and you know what? Let's go to the next video. So we'll wrap up here. Aperture, shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time that the shutter is open for. It's the amount of time that there is light coming in and hitting the film. Aperture is an opening in the lens that changes. It's a diaphragm. It doesn't zoom. Changing the size of that opening, it doesn't zoom or change the size of the picture or anything like that. It just changes how much light comes into the camera. It also controls this thing called depth of field, which we'll talk about later. But for the most part, what we want to be thinking about is shutter speed and aperture control exposure. And then let's talk about the light meter in the next video.